The top business stories live from the Sky News City studio. JD Sports stock market value plunges as it issues a profits warning. The shares in Next hit a record high as it reports buoyant Christmas trading. Plus, UK defence contractor BAE Systems restarts production on howitzer artillery for the US Army. Good afternoon, this is Business Live with me, Ian King. We begin this afternoon with mixed news from two big UK retailers. JD Sports has lost more than a fifth of its stock market value today after warning that profits this year will be lower than expected. Europe's biggest retailer of sports, fashion and outdoor brands said that during the 22 weeks to the 30th of December, its like-for-like sales were up 1.8% on the same period in 2022. JD Sports said clothing sales growth was hit by milder weather from late September onwards, while the peak trading season in the run-up to Christmas have been softer and more promotional than expected, which it said reflected more cautious consumer spending. Regis Schultz, the chief executive, also highlighted tough comparisons with a strong trading period ahead of Christmas 2022. But the fashion retailer Next today upgraded its full-year profit forecast for the fifth time in 8 months after reporting buoyant Christmas trading. Next said that during the 9 weeks to the 30th of December, its full-price sales were up 5.7% on the same period last year. It had been predicting growth of 2% for the period and said sales in both its online and in its stores have been ahead of its expectations. Next said on the face of it, the consumer environment looked more benign than for a number of years, but warned of significant uncertainties, including falling numbers of job vacancies and potential risks to supply chains caused by difficulties with access to the Suez Canal. The shares are currently trading at just over 5% higher and are an all-time high today. Well, joining me now is David Hughes. He's Vice President at the investment bank Stifel. David, great to see you this afternoon. I mean, Next are past masters, aren't they, of managing expectations. Were you surprised by the strength of these numbers?
I was slightly surprised by how strong they were. We were expecting another upgrade by the end of the year. As you say, they're very good at managing expectations. But I was expecting maybe 10 million upgrade, and they came in at about 20 million. So ahead of what I thought, and kind of definitely ahead of what the market expected, showing the strength of the trading at Christmas.
What do you think they've been doing right? Is it the fashions? It's obviously about availability as well, and being keen on price. I mean,
it's a bit of everything, really. What Next have been excellent at for nearly a decade, I think, is the operational excellence. So as you say, on availability, in terms of the way the stores are run and the way that they kind of squeeze that profit out of the business, they're kind of second to none in the retail space, and they really lead the charge there. I think also the way they've diversified their business. So stores were better than expected, but they were only very slightly up. I think it was about 0.6%, whereas it was the online, the international business and the total platform business, which are all areas they've kind of expanded more into recently, where they've saw the growth. So that ability to be more dynamic and to kind of have one area growing when another area is not doing so well just means that they're very versatile and able to kind of do well in most conditions.
And they've also widened the brand portfolio. Are they getting enough juice out of those yet?
It's early days on some of those, so it still makes up a small amount of the business, but I think that is an area of real growth potential for Next, and as it gets bigger, as they kind of pick up more people onto their kind of total platform, that has the potential to really shift the dial in terms of their numbers.
What did you make of these risk factors they outlined, and in particular this issue with the Red Sea and Suez Canal?
Oh, it's an interesting one. I mean, in many ways, Next do the job of the analysts for them, in that they outline the upside and the downside and lay out those risk factors. I mean, Simon Wolfson has always been very cautious in terms of laying out those risks. This time last year, he was talking about the currency crisis and how that might impact. They've gone through that well. It's a bit too early to tell, and I'm not going to kind of comment on foreign policy or the impacts thereof, but I think the fact that it's being flagged shows that it is a risk and it is something that retailers will be concerned about.
Yeah, now what about JD Sports? I mean, they mentioned the weather.
Interesting to see the comparison with Next, who still did such a good job. But interesting that they still saw sales growth, JD Sport, and I think like-for-like, as you say, was 1.8. Overall sales, I think, were about 6% up. So it's not a bad sales story, What the stock market never likes is surprises. And last time JD Sports reported, they actually upgraded their profit for the full year. To now have this profit warning to well below even the previous number has taken people by surprise, and I think that's what's being reflected in the share price.
Yeah, I mean, to my uneducated eye compared with yours, David, I mean, a 22% sell-off in the share price looks a little overdone.
Well, I don't want to comment on whether it's overdone or not, as I don't cover the stock. But I think, as I say, it's definitely a reaction to the surprise in the news, and it's not what the market would have expected, given what the story they have been hearing from JD.
Yeah, as you say, they are still growing sales. And, I mean, the interesting thing, I mean, they've opened more than 200 stores this year. They're expanding at a rapid rate of knots. Has that expansion perhaps taken their eye off the ball in terms of day-to-day operations?
I wouldn't want to say that it's taken their eye off the ball. I think from what I saw reading the trading statement, it seems like a bit of a classic story of they were trying to hit a certain sales number. Sales were a bit softer. They were coming down on that. They have to mark down more. So that combined with the lower sales means that your margins are down and it's hitting your profit number. And
briefly, David, just to go back to Next, is there any read across here for M&S, which most people are assuming has had a good Christmas?
I think that there typically is read across between the two. I mean, it's an interesting one, M&S, because obviously you've got the clothing and home, which is quite comparable to Next and, often goes the same way. Then you've also got food. Now, overall story on food sales, early days has been quite positive, but it's been Tesco, Sainsbury's, Aldi and Lidl who've been getting the plaudits for a strong Christmas. So I don't know what we'll see on M&S. It could be a case that clothing's done a bit better and maybe food a bit worse, but let's wait and see.
We shall see. David, great to see you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The UK economy performed better than expected during the last month of the year, according to a widely followed survey published this morning. The Composite Purchasing Managers Index survey, in which anything above 50 represents growth and anything below that a contraction, came in at 52.1 for December. That was up from 50.7 in November and was the highest reading since June last year. Well, the reading for the services sector, which makes up 4/5 of UK GDP, came in at 53.4, also the best since June last year. The figures potentially point to the UK having grown in the final 3 months of 2023, staving off a recession. Some other business news stories for you now. And Europe's biggest tour operator, TUI, said today that it plans to delist from the London Stock Exchange with effect from June. TUI, which has had a London listing since it merged with First Choice Holidays in 2007, said last month it was considering the move and confirmed today it would press ahead with the decision following a consultation with its shareholders. TUI, which said 77% of all transactions in its shares now took place in Germany, will put the move to a shareholder vote on the 13th of February. New mortgage approvals hit a 5-month high in November, according to Bank of England data published today. The bank said net mortgage approvals for house purchases rose from 47,900 in October to 50,100 in November. Net approvals for remortgaging, meanwhile, increased from 24,000 in October to 27,000 in November. The bank also highlighted a growing trend for savers to switch cash from instant access accounts to deposit accounts during the month. Some £2.6 billion was removed from instant access savings accounts during the month, while there was a net inflow of £3.7 billion into time deposits and ISAs. And Sainsbury's said today it will raise pay for 120,000 workers by 9.1% to £12 per hour from March, or to £13.15 an hour in London. The UK's second largest supermarket said the move would cost it £200 million and was its single biggest ever investment into colleague pay. The pay rate is above the £11.44 per hour to which the national living wage will rise in April this year. Sainsbury's said it would give colleagues an extra £1,910 a year nationally and an extra £2,290 a year in London. And the defence contractor BAE Systems is restarting production for the M777 howitzer for the US Army. BAE said today it had signed a contract worth an initial $50 million to begin making titanium structures for the big gun, for which there have been no orders in 5 years. The work will initially focus on making parts to refurbish guns being used by Ukraine against Russian invaders. But the company said restarting production lines could potentially lead to new orders for entire guns from elsewhere. Well, the story was broken by Alistair MacDonald, a senior reporter for the Wall Street Journal in London, who joins me now. Alistair, good to see you this afternoon. There have been no orders for this weapon for 5 years. Was it becoming obsolete?
Well, there'd been less spending on howitzers for quite some time. You can imagine that in Ukraine war, the howitzer artillery in general made a huge comeback. It was used a lot more than in previous conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan. So you have this increased use of howitzers in general, artillery in general. But you also, militaries were moving towards self-propelled artillery, and the M777 is a towed piece. It has to be towed into position. And militaries saw towed as being much slower, so therefore more vulnerable to counterfire from their enemies. But it's been so people were moving away from towed artillery like the M777, but it's been very popular out in Ukraine because it's seen as being A, very lightweight, and B, just very accurate. But more importantly, it's just very easy to use. So the Ukrainians have not had a long time to learn how to be an artillery person on one of these things. And this is very easy to use. And it's also very easy to repair, according to the Ukrainians.
Yeah, you've actually done a lot of reporting on the ground over in Ukraine. You've seen this piece of hardware in action. Is it the preferred weapon of choice for the Ukrainian artillery?
I don't know about preferred. I mean, I know that the Ukrainians love a statistic whereby they say that 70% of foreign artillery, donated artillery, only 70% is in use at any time. But for the M777, it's 85%. So you can see that it's just a lot more easy to use. It doesn't break as much. So I spent a lot of time with a German artillery piece called the Panzer Howitzer, which is a marvel of modern engineering and technology. But it just breaks down a lot. So a lot of Ukrainians were less satisfied with that, just because, it's so complex and you could argue over-engineered that it just breaks down a lot. Whereas the M777 is a lot more simple, therefore breaks down less. And they found it just very easy to fix. It does have its downsides, though. As I say, it's towed, so it's a lot more vulnerable to counterfire. And if you are a crew member, of course, you have less protection than if you were in a vehicle like you would be with the Panzer Howitzer. And it's very lightweight. It's made of titanium, which is good in terms of moving around, but also makes it more vulnerable to shrapnel because it's just less hardened.
Now, you make the point in your report today that more than 8 countries have approached BAE Systems about potential new orders. Do we have any idea who that might be?
Well, BAE describe it as being in the Americas, Europe and Asia, which doesn't really leave a lot out. So I presume it's a widespread, to be perfectly honest.
Right. Where are these parts likely to be built, do you think? I mean, there's production facilities in both the US and the UK, aren't there?
That's right, Ian. There's from what I remember, there's a big production in Cumbria, actually, in BAE, one of BAE's big hubs. So I would imagine a lot of the work will go there. I think the barrels are still made in the US, but the main structures are British. It's British designed, and the main titanium parts are, I think, will be made in Cumbria, or certainly they used to be made there.
And what about the shells that are fired from the gun?
Well, that's right. I mean, this has been, BAE has a lot of gear out in Ukraine. In fact, probably use more than anyone else. They have the M777, and they have a self-propelled howitzer called the Archer, and they have a load of infantry fighting vehicles, such as the Bradley. But they also have a lot of ammunition. So they're Britain's biggest producer and one of Europe's biggest producers. So they have 2 big facilities. One's in the northeast of England and one's in Wales. And they've expanded these hugely because there's been obviously a massive run on 155, which is the NATO standard caliber ammunition. And BAE and companies like Rheinmetall in Germany and Nexter in France have been trying to increase their production of that.
Now, we're told that this contract is worth an initial $50 million. For those not in the know, how many guns does that buy you effectively?
Ooh, that's a good question, Ian. Unfortunately, one I can't answer. But I've actually heard it's more than that. I've heard that the initial thing's 50, but it could be worth over $100 million. $100 million, that is. But as you say, what you said earlier in your report, what BAE wants is that they've had a number of inquiries. But of course, if countries are inquiring about something that's not made, now they can say, well, actually, it is being made now. And they're hoping that they can go to produce whole guns with these 8 various countries that have shown an initial interest.
OK, Alistair, we've got to leave it there. Congratulations on a great exclusive. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks a lot, Ian. Thank you.
And a reminder that Sky News has today launched its new daily money blog online and on the Sky News app. Your place for consumer news, cost of living advice and features, and the latest on the economy. Head there now to read the first in my series looking at what could happen with the economy in 2024, affecting the money in your pocket. Today, I've looked at where markets are currently expecting interest rates to go. Scan the QR code on the screen right now to read that. Still to come here on Business Live, we'll have a look at how the markets have done this afternoon. Don't go away. The pound has rallied, moderation, interest rates peaking.
And up at 6%.
The highest for 14 years.
Will that be the peak? Will it be a little bit lower?
It's
Crisis.
closer to a potential crash.
So many words, so many meanings. But what do they mean for you and your finances? Stay up to date on Sky News.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
It's turning everybody into, a crazy, violent drug addict.
How are you feeling? I am angry. Are you a hypocrite, sir? Will your candidates win?
I hope so.
I gotta be realistic. My sister's dead.
More than 4 weeks on, there's no murder weapon and no suspect. Mum, how are you feeling today?
Jeffrey said, you answer to Ghislaine, you just don't cross her.
I'm so excited.
Severe nightmares of these people coming in and just taking me in the middle of the night.
I've watched as whole towns were torn apart by natural disaster.
I'm alive and I'm thankful for that.
We take you to the heart of the stories which shape our world.
A lot of cases that I know are reported from Ukrainian missiles themselves.
Ambassador, with respect, I think that's preposterous.
Slay Emirates, slay better. Fly Emirates, fly better.
Thank you.
Well, European stocks have closed to the upside after falling for the first two sessions of the year. How they finished in continental Europe, all of the markets in positive territory. Similar story here in London. The FTSE 100 has finished up by just over 0.5%. Next, the leading blue chip gainer, BAE Systems, which we were talking about before the break, is also ahead by nearly 2% on that howitzer contract win. To the downside, JD Sports has finished 23% lower on the session. That's the leading blue chip faller. Frasers, the owner of Sports Direct, is down nearly 4% in sympathy. Outside the FTSE 100, Tullow Oil is off by just over 4.5% on a broker downgrade, but Aston Martin Lagonda is up by some 3% on hopes it's benefited from a bit of seasonal buying. I didn't get one in my Christmas stocking, to be honest there. Over on Wall Street, equity markets open to the downside following news that new claims for unemployment benefits fell by more than expected last week. That's raised concerns about the timing of US interest rate cuts, but the markets have crept into positive territory as the session has gone on. Talking points on Wall Street this afternoon include Walgreens, the owner of Boots. That's off by more than 8% after it almost halved its dividend payments. On the foreign exchange markets, well, the pound perked up against the dollar on the back of the PMA data earlier on this morning. Currently ahead by 1/5 of 1% against the greenback. It's off by 1/6 of 1% or so against the euro. Meanwhile, the single currency is having a decent day today. It's up 1/3 of 1% against the dollar. Oil prices giving back all of the gains it made earlier in the session. If you're watching our morning programme, barrel of Brent crude currently changing hands at $76.65 a barrel. That's off by just over 2% on the session. Well, joining me now is Haig Bathgate, Head of Investments at Atomos. Hey, good to see you. Now, there was a big broker downgrade earlier in the week by Goldman Sachs on Apple. Looks rather prescient.
Yes, exactly, and I now think other brokers are now following in the footsteps. Yeah, so it's interesting. A half of Apple's entire revenue comes from the iPhone. It's hard to believe that, given all of the services and the other products that they make. So there's a real concern here that there's just lack of demand. Is it a lack of demand from China? Is it people in the West, taking longer to upgrade their phones? Typically, most people I speak to are taking 2 or 3 years longer to replace their phones these days. Or is it just wider spread consumer slowdown? Obviously, we've seen interest rates increase so much, and a lot of Apple's products are inadvertently financed through some way, shape or form, particularly the iPhones.
Indeed, and obviously this is a bellwether for US consumer spending in particular. There is a school of thought out there that the Americans have burned through all their sort of pandemic-enforced savings now. That would kind of speak to that.
Yeah, well, that's right, and we've been trying to wait for this. Obviously, there was a build-up of savings through the lockdown period, and we've been all trying to work out, including the central banks, when that's coming to an end. And given how much interest rates have increased, I mean, interest rates were averaging less than 0.5% for 10 years, and all of a sudden they're over 5%. So at some point, this is going to bite, and it would appear that that's starting to happen now, which, again, might sort of feed through to some of the forecasts of recession coming.
Yeah, and then, yet again, we got more figures suggesting again that the US jobs market is much stronger than we thought.
Yeah, and this is the quandary, and of course the central banks aren't going to even contemplate reducing interest rates as much as they're goaded by the markets until we see the unemployment rate increase. That's what everybody's focused on, both in the UK and the US, and it's staying incredibly resilient. We're starting to see more of a sign. The JOLTS survey was certainly not quite as strong. I mean, it was there or thereabouts, but it was certainly a little bit weaker than expectations. But I think if we start to see unemployment increase, that's a big sign for central banks softening their stance.
Well, closer to home, you mentioned central banks there. We had these mortgage approvals figures from the Bank of England. What was your takeaway from that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The UK is incredibly sensitive to interest rate moves, much more so than the US. The average mortgage in the US is a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. In the UK, as we know, mortgages are much shorter term, between 2 and 5 year fixed-rate or tracker-rate mortgages. And what we've seen is, obviously, as expectations have come through that rates are peaking, that's giving consumers enough confidence to go out and actually start increasing purchases of property, remortgages and so on. And I think it's really interesting just to see how sensitive the UK economy is to interest rates.
It really is. Well, I mean, we had Rightmove on the programme this morning saying that they had a record number of sellers putting their house up on the site on Boxing Day of all things. I mean, they were implying that's quite a good augur for sort of activity this year.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's a classic thing. Property is very illiquid. And unless people are forced to sell at the rate, or the price that they're expecting, they'll tend to hold off, and that's what we see. So there's usually quite a lagged effect with property sales. So it's only when people are forced to sell that we start to see things sort of feed through, in quite a marked way, and it usually feed through to quite large markdowns. We're not seeing that yet, which would imply that the consumer is not yet distressed. But look, I think everybody's sitting on their hands and waiting to see what happens. There's so many variables at the moment, and we just have to see what actually happens in practice.
Well, and not least the fact that 27 million workers this month are going to have a pay packet bigger than last month's because of the national insurance cuts.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, that will feed directly through to consumption. We know that the UK consumer is quite highly indebted, doesn't need too much encouragement to go out and spend, particularly if they've got confidence about job security and so on, which again feeds back to the unemployment rate. And I think in the UK, the markets will sort of oscillate between this do we hold, do we cut? But until we see an increase in the unemployment rate, that's unlikely to feed through to any kind of short-term rate decreases.
Very briefly, Haig, does that mean that the UK's dodged a recession?
I don't think so. I mean, again, I've been of the view that rates will probably fall faster. I mean, I think the tail end of last year, obviously with the lack of liquidity in the markets, things got slightly overdone. I still maintain that the UK is not in that competitive a position. And I think, you know, there's lots of cuts that can be made through the practical implementation of AI tools and so on next year.
OK, Haig, got to leave it there. Good to see you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it from me. I'm back again at 11:30 tomorrow morning. Hope very much to see you then for the next edition of Business Live. Coming up next, it's Mark Austin with the News Hour. And he's got Luke Littler, the darts sensation, on the programme. Do stay tuned for that. Cheerio.